Commander Vex High stood before the mixed group of young alien cadets in the military academy on Kepler Station, and his forearms moved slowly as he adjusted the holographic display behind him, showing a barren, rocky landscape covered in smoke and debris from an old battlefield. The cybernetic implants covering half his reptilian face glowed softly in the dim light of the classroom, as 15 years of memories came flooding back to him like a nightmare he could never escape. The cadets from various alien species sat quietly in their seats with their different eyes all focused on the grizzled war veteran who had requested to speak with them about the humans and their strange ways of fighting that had haunted him since the end of the Terran Galactic Confederation War. You young ones think you understand warfare because you have studied the ancient battles of our people and learned the proper tactics from your instructors, Vexahai said, in his deep, gravelly voice, that carried the weight of someone who had seen too much death and destruction during his long military career. But today I will tell you about creatures that fight in ways that make no sense according to everything we know about military strategy and survival instincts. The holographic display shifted to show Proxima Ridge, where jagged rocks rose from. Red soil under an alien sky, and the cadets could see the strategic positions marked in blue for the Zephyrian forces and red for the human defenders who had been trapped there during one of the bloodiest battles of the war. Vexahai's mandibles clicked together nervously as he remembered that terrible day when everything he thought he knew about combat was turned upside down by the actions of a small group of human soldiers who refused to follow the basic rules of warfare. My battalion had cornered a human unit on this ridge, he continued, while pointing at the display with one of his clawed hands, and his voice became quieter as painful memories surfaced. 20 of our warriors for every one of theirs, and they had almost no ammunition left according to our intelligence reports, and no way to call for backup because we had destroyed their communication equipment in the first attack. A young Zephyrian cadet raised her hand and asked why the humans did not surrender immediately, since any rational military force would have given up when faced with such impossible odds, and Vexhai's scarred face twisted into what might have been a smile but looked more like a grimace of pain as he prepared to explain something that still kept him awake at night after all these years. That is exactly what we expected them to do, he replied, and activated another part of the holographic display that showed the positions of the human soldiers led by their captain Jake Morrison, who had been wounded in 3 places but continued to move among his troops and coordinate their defense. Our commander gave them 30 minutes to surrender and even offered to treat their wounded and send them to prison camps instead of killing them outright. The display zoomed in to show Captain Morrison's position where he crouched behind a makeshift barrier of rocks and debris, with his uniform torn and blood seeping through bandages on his arm and leg, while he shouted orders to his remaining soldiers who numbered less than 40 against the 800 Zephyrian warriors surrounding their position. Lieutenant Kate Sullivan lay unconscious nearby with a severe head injury from shrapnel, but Morrison kept checking on her between coordinating the defense and treating other wounded soldiers with medical supplies that were running dangerously low. Instead of surrendering, Morrison did something that made no military sense, Vexhai said, and his voice dropped to almost a whisper as he relived those moments that had changed his understanding of what humans were capable of doing when cornered. He gathered his soldiers together and told them they were going to fight harder than they had ever fought before because giving up was not an option when their brothers and sisters were counting on them to hold the line. The holographic display showed what happened next, as human soldiers began moving through the rocks with a desperate energy that seemed to come from somewhere deep inside them, rather than from any logical military training, and they started using their empty ration packs to create improvised explosive devices that could damage Zephyrian armor when detonated at close range. Wounded humans who could no longer walk properly positioned themselves as stationary gun platforms and continued firing even when plasma bolts burned through their bodies while their comrades advanced with whatever weapons they could find, including knives and pieces of broken metal from damaged equipment. The sound they made, HFY said, and his cybernetic eye flickered as emotional subroutines activated memories he wished he could delete forever. When Morrison gave the order to charge our positions, the humans let out a war cry that came from their very souls. And it was not the sound of soldiers following orders, but the howl of pack animals protecting their young from predators. Several cadets shifted uncomfortably in their seats, as HFY described how seasoned Zephyrian warriors, who had fought in dozens of battles across the galaxy, suddenly found themselves backing away from humans who seemed to have transformed into something beyond rational military opponents, and became forces of nature that could not be reasoned with or intimidated into stopping their attack. The final moments of the battle played out on the holographic display as Morrison lifted the unconscious Sullivan onto his back and charged through plasma fire while laying down covering fire with his sidearm and screaming at his remaining soldiers to follow him toward the Zephyrian lines. That day, I learned humans do not fight just to win battles, HFY concluded as the display faded to black. They fight to make sure their pack survives, even when survival means certain death. HFY noticed how some of the cadets were looking at each other with worried expressions after hearing about the battle at Proxima Ridge, and he could see they were beginning to understand that humans were not like other species they had studied in their military courses, but he knew they needed to hear more before they could truly grasp what made these creatures so dangerous in warfare. The classroom felt colder now as he prepared to share another memory that had been burned into his mind during the siege of Titan Station, where the Zephyrian fleet had achieved what should have been a complete victory over the human space forces, but had learned that destroying human ships did not always mean the fighting was over. You might think that humans are only dangerous when they fight on solid ground where they can use the terrain to their advantage, HFY said, while bringing up a new holographic display that showed the black void of space dotted with the burning. Wrecks of human and Zephyrian vessels around a massive space station that orbited one of the outer planets in the Terran system. But their madness extends to naval warfare in ways that will make you question everything you know about space combat and the basic instincts for survival that every intelligent species should possess. The display zoomed in to show the human destroyer called Iron Will, which had been one of dozens of ships defending Titan Station against the Zephyrian fleet, and the cadets could see how the vessel had been gutted by plasma fire, with massive holes torn through its hull and atmosphere, venting into space while emergency lights flickered weakly in the sections that still had power. Lieutenant Commander Ryan Brooks had been the captain of this ship, and HFY remembered watching through his command screen as the human vessel took hit after hit, but continued firing its weapons until the final plasma torpedo struck the bridge and the ship went dark. Our fleet had completely destroyed the human defensive line, and we were celebrating another easy victory over these primitive creatures who dared to challenge the might of the Zephyrian Empire. HFY continued, and his mandibles clicked together with the memory of how confident they had all felt in those first moments after the battle appeared to be over. The human ships were burning hulks drifting through space, and our sensors showed no life signs from any of them, so we prepared to move in and capture the station. A young cadet from the insectoid Kethmar species asked why the Zephyrians had not simply destroyed the station immediately instead of trying to capture it, and HFY explained that Titan Station contained valuable research facilities and manufacturing equipment that the Empire wanted to use for their own purposes, which meant they needed to take it intact rather than reducing it to scrap metal with their heavy weapons. The display showed how the Zephyrian ships had begun moving toward the station in formation, while scanning for any remaining human defenses that might pose a threat to the boarding operation. That was when the dead ships began to move again, HFY said, and his cybernetic eye flickered as he accessed the recorded data from that day, which showed the Iron Will and several other human vessels that had been completely disabled, suddenly adjusting their positions and bringing their weapon systems back online despite having no apparent power source or life support. Our sensors were telling us these ships were empty tombs floating in space, but somehow they were still fighting. The holographic display replayed the moment when the Iron Will fired its remaining missiles at the Zephyrian flagship while broadcasting a message on all frequencies from Lieutenant Commander Brooks, who was supposed to be dead, according to every scanner reading they had taken of his ship. His voice came through the speakers in the classroom as a recording that Vexa High had listened to hundreds of times, but still sent chills through his scaled hide when he heard the human officer speaking calmly, despite the fact that his ship was venting atmosphere and radiation that should have killed him within minutes. "This is Lieutenant Commander Ryan Brooks of the destroyer Iron Will, and I want you alien bastards to know that you might have killed my ship, but you have not killed my crew's fighting spirit." The recording played while the display showed how the human vessel continued maneuvering and firing even though massive sections of its hull were missing and plasma fires were burning throughout its interior. Specialist Amy Chen and Petty Officer Carlos Martinez are here with me in what is left of our bridge, and we are going to keep shooting until we run out of ammunition or our hearts stop beating. Vexhai explained that the three humans had remained at their posts in hard vacuum after their ship lost life support, and they were using manual targeting systems to coordinate attacks on Zephyrian vessels while wearing emergency suits that provided only limited protection against the radiation pouring from their damaged reactor core. The display showed thermal readings that indicated the humans were slowly dying from exposure, but they continued working their weapon systems with mechanical precision as if death was just another factor to work around rather than something to fear. For 6 hours, those three humans turned their dead ship into a weapon that continued to fight long after any rational crew would have abandoned it, Vexahai said, and his voice carried a mixture of respect and horror as he described how the Iron Will had destroyed 2 Zephyrian cruisers and damaged several other ships during its final battle. They knew they were going to die slowly and painfully from radiation poisoning, but they kept fighting because their sacrifice was buying time for civilian evacuation transports to escape from the inner planets. The final transmission from the SEI. Iron Will played through the classroom speakers as Brooks spoke his last words into a communication system that was barely functioning, while Amy Chen and Carlos Martinez worked frantically to load the final missile into a launch tube that had been damaged by plasma fire. His voice was weaker now, but still determined as he gave his final report to any human forces that might be listening, and the cadets could hear the sound of alarms and explosions in the background as the ship's systems failed one by one. "Tell Earth we held the line," Brooks said in the recording, and then the transmission cut to static as the Iron Will finally succumbed to the damage it had sustained, but not before launching its last missile, which struck the Zephyrian command ship and killed the admiral who had been coordinating the attack on Titan Station. "Tell them we did our duty." Several more cadets quietly left the classroom as Vexhai finished explaining how the battle had ended with a Zephyrian victory that felt more like a defeat, because they had learned that destroying human ships did not necessarily stop human crews from fighting, and that these creatures would continue to be dangerous even when they were technically already dead from wounds that would have incapacitated any other species in the galaxy. The remaining cadets in the classroom were now looking pale and nervous as they began to understand that their instructors had never taught them how to fight against an enemy that seemed to operate by completely different rules than every other species in the galaxy, and one young Zephyrian cadet raised her hand to ask if human medical personnel were at least less dangerous than their combat soldiers, since every civilized military force treated healers as non-combatants who should be protected rather than targeted during warfare. Vexhai's mandibles clicked together in what might have been laughter, but sounded more like the warning rattle of a venomous snake as he prepared to destroy yet another assumption about how wars were supposed to be fought, and he activated a new holographic display that showed the ruins of New Geneva where urban combat had raged for weeks between Zephyrian forces and human defenders. "You think medical personnel are safe because they follow some ancient code about not harming healers during battle?" Vexhai said while the display zoomed in on a large building that had been converted into a field hospital where human wounded were being treated by doctors and nurses who worked frantically to save lives while explosions shook the walls around them. But humans have a different understanding of what it means to be a healer, and combat medic Laura Hendricks taught us that lesson in ways we will never forget. The holographic display showed the field hospital where Hendricks had been working. For 3 days without sleep, to treat the constant stream of wounded soldiers who were brought in from the fighting in the streets, and her uniform was stained with blood from dozens of patients, while her face showed the exhaustion of someone who had pushed herself far beyond normal human limits. The Zephyrian forces had been following their standard protocol of avoiding attacks on medical facilities because their military doctrine stated that healers were sacred and should not be harmed even during the most brutal conflicts. But they were about to learn that human medics did not see themselves as separate from the war. We had surrounded the hospital and cut off all supply lines, thinking that the medical staff would eventually surrender when they ran out of medicine and equipment. Vexhai continued, and his cybernetic eye displayed tactical information about the siege that had lasted for 2 weeks while Zephyrian commanders debated whether to storm the building or wait for the humans to give up. Our intelligence reports said there were only medical personnel inside, treating wounded soldiers and civilians, so we assumed it would be an easy capture once they realized their position was hopeless. A cadet from the aquatic Meltar species asked why the Zephyrians had not simply bypassed the hospital and continued their advance through the city since medical facilities were not supposed to be military targets, and Vexhai explained that the building was located at a critical intersection that controlled access to 3 major roads, which meant that any force trying to move through that area would be vulnerable to attack from the hospital's elevated position. The display showed how the human medics had been using the hospital's communication equipment to coordinate artillery strikes on Zephyrian positions while simultaneously treating wounded soldiers in the basement operating rooms. That was when we learned that Laura Hendricks was not just a healer but a warrior who happened to be skilled in medicine, Vexhai said, and the display replayed security footage from inside the hospital that showed the human medic performing surgery on a severely wounded sergeant named Tony Williams, while plasma bolts from Zephyrian weapons shattered windows and sent debris flying through the operating room. She had one hand inside the soldier's chest cavity repairing damaged organs, while her other hand held a pulse rifle that she was using to return fire at our advance teams. The footage showed how Hendricks had rigged the entire hospital with explosive devices that could be detonated remotely if the Zephyrian forces managed to breach the building, and she had trained the other medical staff, including Private Lisa Park, who was barely out of medical school, to operate heavy weapons that had been salvaged from destroyed human vehicles. The young medics worked in shifts with some treating patients while others manned defensive positions, and they had turned the hospital into a fortress that could hold off an entire Zephyrian battalion while continuing to function as a medical facility. The most disturbing thing was watching her work, Vexhai said, and his voice carried a mixture of admiration and horror as he described how Hendricks had continued performing complex surgical procedures even while under direct fire from Zephyrian weapons. She would be removing shrapnel from a soldier's brain with microscopic precision, and then without missing a beat, she would grab her weapon and put 3 shots through the helmet of a Zephyrian trooper who was trying to enter through a window. The holographic display showed the final assault on the hospital when Zephyrian forces finally decided to storm the building and found themselves facing a medical staff that had been transformed into a highly effective fighting unit under Hendricks's leadership, and every doctor and nurse was armed with military weapons while continuing to treat patients who were being brought in from the battle raging throughout the hospital corridors. The human medics had studied Zephyrian anatomy during the weeks of siege, and they knew exactly where to aim their shots to cause maximum damage to armored opponents. When we finally breached the main operating room, we found Hendricks still working on a patient while 3 Zephyrian soldiers lay dead around her feet. Vexhai continued, and the display showed the final moments of the battle when the human medic had transmitted her last message to any remaining human forces in the city. She looked up at our squad leader and calmly informed him that she had rigged the entire building with enough explosives to level 3 city blocks. The recording of Hendrix's final transmission played through the classroom speakers as she spoke with the same calm professionalism that she might have used when discussing a patient's treatment options, and her voice showed no fear, even though she knew she was about to die along with everyone else in the hospital, including the patients she had spent days trying to save. Her message was brief and to the point as she explained that the Geneva Convention did not apply to alien invaders who threatened human civilians, and that she had taken an oath to do no harm but protecting her patients from hostile aliens was part of that oath. In case you are wondering, the Geneva Convention does not apply to alien invaders, Hendrix said in the recording, while the sound of weapons fire echoed in the background, and she continued working on her patient even as Zephyrian soldiers surrounded her position. I took an oath to first do no harm, but keeping my patients safe from you. Creatures is not harm, it is healing. The explosion that followed destroyed the hospital and killed everyone inside, including 43 Zephyrian soldiers, and Vexhai explained that it was only later during the medical examination of Hendrix's body that they discovered she had been wounded herself 3 days earlier and had been slowly bleeding to death while continuing to operate on other patients and using combat stimulants to keep herself conscious and functional. The human medic had calculated exactly how long she could continue working before blood loss would make her unable to perform surgery, and she had timed the final battle to occur before she would have collapsed from her injuries. That day, we learned that human healers are not separate from their military, Vexhai concluded, as the display faded to black and several more cadets quietly left the classroom, unable to process what they had just heard. They are warriors who happen to specialize in keeping other warriors alive long enough to keep fighting. The classroom had grown noticeably colder as more cadets had quietly left during the previous stories, and Vexhai could see that only the most dedicated students remained in their seats, with their faces showing a mixture of fascination and horror, as they began to understand that everything they had been taught about warfare and civilized behavior during military conflicts was meaningless when applied to humans who seemed to operate according to their own twisted logic. He adjusted his cybernetic implants and brought up another holographic display that showed Armstrong Base, which had been one of the most important human research facilities in the outer system, where scientists and engineers worked on advanced technology that could potentially change the balance of power in the war between the Zephyrian Empire and the Terran Confederation. Perhaps you think that human support personnel like engineers and technicians would be more reasonable than their soldiers and medics? Vexhai said, while the display showed the massive underground complex of Armstrong Base with its laboratories and workshops and living quarters for nearly 10,000 personnel who were supposed to be non-combatants focused on research and development rather than direct military action. But during the siege of Armstrong Base, we learned that humans do not make distinctions between fighters and builders when their survival is threatened. The holographic display zoomed in to show the base's main reactor facility where Chief Engineer Brad Thompson and his team of technicians had been working around the clock to keep the power systems operational, while Zephyrian bombardment rained down on the facility from orbit and caused massive damage to critical infrastructure, including the life support systems that kept the underground complex habitable for the human researchers and their families who had been trapped there for weeks. Thompson was a large man with graying hair and calloused hands who had spent 30 years maintaining fusion reactors in some of the most dangerous environments in human space, but nothing had prepared him for the impossible choice he would soon have to make. Our orbital bombardment had damaged the base's reactor cooling systems, and their life support would fail within 72 hours unless they could complete repairs that should have taken weeks under normal circumstances. Vexhai continued, and the display showed technical readouts that indicated how the human engineers were facing a problem that had no safe solution according to every engineering manual ever written. The only way to fix the damage was to work inside the reactor core while it was still operational, which meant absorbing lethal doses of radiation that would kill anyone who entered that area. A young cadet from the silicon-based Vorthak species asked why the humans did not simply surrender and request assistance from Zephyrian engineers who could have repaired the damage without risking any lives, and Vex High's scarred face twisted into his characteristic grimace as he prepared to explain. Another example of human logic that defied all reasonable expectations. The display showed how Thompson had gathered his entire engineering team in the main workshop and explained their options, which included surrendering to the Zephyrian forces or attempting repairs that would require volunteers to sacrifice their lives to save the rest of the base personnel. Thompson told his engineers that they had a choice between dying slowly when the life support failed or dying quickly from radiation exposure while fixing the problem, Vex High said, and his cybernetic eye flickered as he accessed the recorded conversations from that final meeting where the human engineers had calmly discussed their own deaths as if they were solving a routine technical problem. What happened next still haunts me because it showed how humans can turn even suicide into a precisely calculated engineering solution. The holographic display replayed the security footage from inside the reactor facility as Thompson and his team began implementing what they called the rotation protocol, where each engineer would work inside the radioactive core for exactly calculated periods of time before being replaced by another volunteer who would continue the repairs while the previous worker went to the medical bay to die from radiation poisoning. Technician Mary Foster was the first to volunteer for a shift inside the reactor core, and she spent 47 minutes replacing damaged cooling pipes, while her dosimeter readings climbed to levels that would have been immediately fatal to most alien species. They had calculated exactly how much radiation exposure each person could absorb before death became inevitable, and they created a work schedule that would maximize their productive time while ensuring the repairs could be completed. Vex High explained, and the display showed the mathematical models that Thompson had created to determine how many engineers would need to die to save the rest of the base population. Each volunteer knew precisely how long they would live after their shift, and they used that time to train their replacements and say goodbye to their families. Engineer Pete Garcia took the second shift and worked for 39 minutes installing new radiation shielding around the reactor core while his body absorbed enough radioactive particles to kill him within 6 hours. But he used those final hours to write detailed instructions for the next volunteer and record personal messages for his children, who were living in the residential section of the base. The display showed how Garcia worked with mechanical precision despite knowing that every minute inside the reactor was shortening his life, and he only stopped when his hands began shaking too badly to operate the delicate repair equipment. The most disturbing aspect was how calmly they approached their own deaths, Vex High said, and his voice carried a note of awe as he described watching the human engineers work with the same methodical professionalism they might have used for routine maintenance tasks. There was no panic or emotional breakdown, just a group of technical specialists solving a problem that required some of them to die in order to save their colleagues and families. The holographic display showed Thompson taking the final shift inside the reactor core, where he spent over an hour completing the most complex repairs while his radiation exposure climbed to levels that should have killed him immediately, but somehow he remained conscious and functional long enough to restore the cooling systems and stabilize the reactor before finally collapsing from radiation poisoning. His final log entry was recorded as he lay dying in the medical bay while watching the life support systems return to full operational status and knowing that his sacrifice had saved nearly 10,000 people. Reactor stable life support at 100%. 23 good people gave their lives for this. Make it count, Thompson said in his final recording, while the base's medical staff tried unsuccessfully to treat radiation damage that had destroyed most of his internal organs. Tell my wife I kept my promise to bring everyone home safe. The display showed the aftermath of the repairs as the surviving engineers worked to document everything that had been done so that future maintenance could be performed safely, and they treated the deaths of their colleagues not as a tragedy, but as a successful engineering project that had achieved its primary objective of keeping the base operational. The 23 engineers who had died from radiation exposure were buried in a memorial garden that was built over the reactor facility, and their names were engraved on a plaque that read simply, "Engineers who solved the impossible problem." The siege ended 3 days later when our ground forces finally breached the base defenses, only to find that the human engineers had used their remaining time to rig every critical system with explosives that would destroy 30 years of research, rather than let it fall into Zephyrian hands. Vexhai concluded as the display faded to show the empty classroom where only a handful of cadets remained. We captured a facility full of dead engineers and empty laboratories because these humans had decided that if they could not keep their work safe, then no one would benefit from it. The few remaining cadets sat in stunned silence as they tried to process the implications of what they had just learned about human engineering personnel who could transform routine maintenance into heroic sacrifice and treat their own deaths as just another variable in a complex technical equation that needed to be solved to protect their families and colleagues from alien invaders. Only 5 cadets remained in the classroom now, and their faces had grown pale as they began to understand that they were learning about an enemy that could not be defeated through conventional military tactics because humans seemed to view death itself as just another weapon to be used against their opponents, and Vexhai could see the fear growing in their eyes as he prepared to share the most terrifying memory from his long military career. The holographic display activated to show Terranova, which had been humanity's most important colony world, with over 50 million civilians living in cities and towns scattered across the planet's 3 main continents, and it had represented everything that humans valued about their expansion into the galaxy, including their families and their future as a spacefaring species. You might think that humans would fight differently when defending their homes and families compared to how they behave during military operations in space or on remote battlefields, Vexhai said, while the display showed peaceful scenes of Terra, Nova with its green forests and blue oceans and bustling cities where human children played in parks, while their parents worked in offices and factories that produced goods for trade throughout the Terran Confederation. But when our invasion fleet arrived at Terranova, we discovered that humans do not have civilians in the way that other species understand the term. The display shifted to show the Zephyrian invasion force as it approached Terranova with hundreds of ships carrying assault troops and heavy weapons designed to overwhelm the planet's defenses and capture the colony intact so that it could be used as a base for further operations against human space, and the initial bombardment had destroyed most of the orbital defense platforms, while landing craft began delivering Zephyrian soldiers to strategic locations around the major population centers. Colonel Steve Mitchell commanded the planetary defense forces from a bunker deep beneath the capital city, and he had been coordinating the resistance for 3 days when it became clear that conventional military tactics would not be enough to stop the invasion. Our intelligence estimates suggested that Terranova had fewer than 100,000 trained military personnel scattered across an entire planet, which meant that most of the population consisted of non-combatants who would surrender once. They realized that resistance was futile. Vexhai continued, and his cybernetic implants flickered as he accessed the tactical reports from the invasion that had initially proceeded according to plan, with Zephyrian forces securing key objectives and preparing to demand the surrender of the remaining human defenders. But Colonel Mitchell activated something called Last Stand Protocol, and everything we thought we knew about human society turned out to be completely wrong. A remaining cadet from the energy-based flux-tar species asked what Last Stand Protocol meant, and Vexhai explained that it was apparently a pre-planned emergency procedure that had been built into every human colony from the very beginning of their expansion into space, and it involved converting the entire civilian population into a military force that would fight to the death, rather than surrender their homes to alien invaders. The display showed how Mitchell's announcement had been broadcast simultaneously to every communication device on Terranova, including personal computers and entertainment systems and emergency broadcast networks that reached even the most remote settlements. This is our home. These are our children. We do not yield ground to those who would harm them. Mitchell said in the recording that Vexahai had listened to countless times while trying to understand how an entire planet could transform itself into a military unit within hours of receiving the activation order. If you want Terranova, you will have to pry it from our cold, dead hands. The holographic display showed what happened next, as millions of human civilians reported to predetermined locations where they received basic weapons training and tactical instructions from military personnel who had been secretly embedded throughout the colony's infrastructure for exactly this purpose. And within 12 hours, every teacher and accountant and shopkeeper and retiree on Terranova had been organized into defensive units that began fortifying their neighborhoods and preparing for urban warfare. Dr. Helen Murphy, who had been running a pediatric clinic in the capital city, was suddenly commanding a battalion of medical personnel who had been trained to treat combat injuries while simultaneously operating heavy weapons that had been hidden in hospital basements. The most disturbing aspect was watching how quickly they adapted to their new roles, Vexahai said, and his voice carried a note of incredulous horror as he described seeing elderly humans who should have been enjoying retirement instead learning to operate anti-aircraft missiles, while teenagers who should have been attending school were setting up sniper positions in apartment buildings. There was no confusion or hesitation because every civilian on Terranova had apparently been preparing for this moment their entire lives. Teacher Kevin O'Brien had been instructing 8-year-old children in mathematics and literature just hours before. He was leading a squad of former educators in guerrilla attacks against Zephyrian supply convoys, and his classroom had been converted into an ammunition depot where his students helped assemble explosive devices while learning about chemical reactions and physics in ways that no textbook could have taught them. The display showed how O'Brien used his knowledge of child psychology to train young humans to act as scouts and messengers who could move through the city without attracting attention from Zephyrian patrols. We found ourselves fighting against an entire planet where every building could be a fortress and every person could be a soldier. Vexahai continued, and the display showed tactical maps that revealed how the human defenders had turned Terranova into a maze of death traps and ambush, points where Zephyrian forces could be attacked from any direction at any time. Accountants were operating missile launchers while librarians coordinated artillery strikes, and even the elderly were volunteering for suicide missions rather than allowing us to capture strategic objectives. The holographic display replayed footage from the battle for Terranova's main spaceport, where a group of retired humans had loaded themselves with explosives and walked directly into a formation of Zephyrian tanks while singing what appeared to be an ancient human war song. And their sacrifice had destroyed enough enemy vehicles to allow younger defenders to retake the facility. The sight of humans who should have been grandparents instead, choosing to die as human bombs, had shaken even the most experienced Zephyrian soldiers who had never encountered an enemy where the distinction between combatants and non-combatants had completely disappeared. The final assault on the capital city lasted for 6 weeks, and every street became a battlefield where we faced enemies who knew the terrain perfectly and fought with the desperation of creatures defending their young, Vexahai said, and his scarred face showed the emotional toll that the Terranova campaign had taken on him even after all these years. We were not conquering a planet, we were invading a military training ground where 50 million humans had been transformed into the most dedicated and ruthless fighting force we had ever encountered. The display showed the final moments of the battle when Colonel Mitchell broadcast his last message from the ruins of the Planetary Defense Center, while human civilians continued fighting in the streets around him, and his words carried the promise that Terranova would never be truly conquered, even if every human on the planet died defending it. His voice was calm and determined, as he explained that the humans had already won because they had shown the galaxy what would happen to any species that threatened human families and children. You think you are conquering Terranova, but you are wrong. Mitchell said in his final transmission, while explosions shook the bunker around him and the sound of weapons fire echoed through the communication system. "You have just entered the galaxy's largest military training ground, and every human you kill will teach the survivors how to kill 10 of you." The battle for Terranova had ended with a Zephyrian victory that felt more like a defeat because the invasion had cost nearly half of their assault force and taken months longer than planned, while teaching the Empire that attacking human civilian populations would result in facing an enemy where every person was a potential soldier willing to die rather than surrender their homes and families to alien invaders. The classroom was nearly empty now, with only 3 cadets remaining in their seats, and their faces showed the haunted expressions of students who had learned too much about the true nature of warfare and the creatures that humans could become. When their survival was threatened, and HFY slowly removed his military decorations and placed them on the desk before him as he prepared to share the final truth that had ended the war between the Zephyrian Empire and the Terran Confederation. The holographic display activated one last time to show the blue marble of Earth hanging in space, surrounded by the massive fleet that had been assembled for the final assault on humanity's home world, where billions of humans lived and worked. In cities that had existed for thousands of years before the first Zephyrian had ever looked up at the stars. You have heard about human soldiers and medics and engineers and civilians, but now I must tell you about the day we learned what humans become when you threaten their home world, HFY said, and his voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed the end of everything he had believed about military superiority and the natural order of the galaxy, where advanced civilizations were supposed to dominate primitive species that had only recently learned to travel between the stars. The High Command had decided that destroying Earth would finally break human resistance and force the surviving colonies to surrender. The display showed the approach of the Zephyrian invasion fleet, which represented the largest military force that the Empire had ever assembled, with over 2,000 ships carrying enough firepower to reduce entire continents to molten glass, and the initial plan had been to demonstrate this overwhelming superiority by destroying several major human cities before demanding unconditional surrender from whatever government remained functional after the bombardment. Admiral Nancy Price commanded Earth's defenses from a bunker buried so deep beneath the surface that even the most powerful Zephyrian weapons could not reach it, and she had been coordinating the planet's response to the approaching invasion for weeks. Our intelligence reports suggested that Earth had only minimal orbital defenses and a small fleet of outdated warships that would be destroyed within hours of the first attack, HFY continued, and the display showed tactical assessments that indicated the human homeworld should have fallen quickly once the Zephyrian fleet demonstrated its superior technology and firepower. But Admiral Price transmitted a message directly to our fleet that made our commanders realize they had made a fundamental error in their understanding of what Earth represented to humanity. The recording of Price's transmission played through the classroom speakers, and her voice carried the calm confidence of someone who knew something that her enemies did not understand about the true nature of the planet they were preparing to attack and the people who lived there, including not just the current generation, but all the humans who had been born and died on Earth throughout their species' long history of warfare and survival against impossible odds. "You think you are invading Earth, but you are wrong," Price said in the recording, while the display showed defensive installations that were being activated across the planet's surface and orbital space as millions of humans prepared to defend their homeworld with everything they possessed, including their lives. "You have just entered the galaxy's largest military training ground, where every human you kill will teach the survivors how to kill 10 of you, and where dying for Earth is considered the highest honor our species can achieve," HFY explained. That the Zephyrian fleet had expected to face orbital defense platforms and planetary shield generators, but instead they found themselves confronting something that no military academy had ever taught them how to fight against, which was an entire planet that had been converted into a single massive weapon system operated by billions of humans who had been preparing for this moment since childhood. The display showed how Earth's cities had been transformed into fortress complexes where every building could serve as a military installation, and every citizen had been trained to operate weapon systems that could target spacecraft in orbit. The bombardment of Earth's surface began as planned, but instead of breaking human resistance, it seemed to make them fight harder, HFY said, and his cybernetic implants flickered as he accessed memories of the orbital assault that had destroyed several major population centers but had somehow resulted in increased defensive fire from the planet below. For every human city we destroyed, 10 more defensive installations came online and started shooting at our fleet. The holographic display showed General Marcus Bell coordinating ground defenses from what remained of the North American military command center, while President Linda Hayes broadcast messages of defiance to human colonies throughout the galaxy, and their words carried the promise that Earth would never surrender, even if every human on the planet died fighting the Zephyrian invaders. The planet's entire population had been organized into a resistance network that treated urban warfare as a normal part of daily life, where children learned to operate anti-aircraft weapons while their parents worked in factories that produced ammunition and explosives. The most terrifying moment came when we realized that fighting humans was changing us into something we no longer recognized, HFY said, and his voice dropped to barely above a whisper as he described how the prolonged campaign had transformed Zephyrian soldiers from disciplined military professionals into creatures that committed atrocities against civilian populations in their frustration at being unable to defeat an enemy that seemed to grow stronger with every defeat. We were becoming monsters because that was the only way to fight monsters. The display showed intercepted human communications from resistance cells operating in the ruins of destroyed cities where survivors had organized themselves into guerrilla units that launched attacks against Zephyrian occupation forces, and their tactics became increasingly brutal as the war continued, with both sides committing acts that violated every principle of civilized warfare. The humans had learned to use the bodies of their own dead as weapons by booby-trapping corpses with explosives that would detonate when Zephyrian soldiers tried to clear the battlefield. Admiral Price's final transmission came from the ruins of Earth's capital city, where she had been coordinating the defense for months while living in tunnels beneath the rubble. HFY continued, and the display showed the devastated landscape where billions of humans had died, but where resistance continued from underground bunkers and hidden installations that seemed to spring up faster than they could be destroyed. Her message was broadcast simultaneously to every Zephyrian ship in the fleet and to human colonies throughout the galaxy. The recording of Price's final transmission played as she spoke from the ruins of what had once been humanity's greatest city, while the sound of explosions and weapons fire echoed in the background, and her words carried the promise that Earth's destruction would only mark the beginning of humanity's war against the Zephyrian Empire, rather than its end, because the lesson that humans could learn from their homeworld's fate would be passed on to every human colony and military unit in the galaxy. Earth dies today, but Earth's children will remember what you did here, and they will spend the rest of their lives making you pay for every human life you have taken, Price said in her final message, while the bunker collapsed around her, and her voice carried the absolute certainty of someone who knew that her death would inspire rather than discourage human resistance. We have taught our children that dying for humanity is the greatest honor they can achieve, and now you will learn what that means. HFY removed his final decoration and placed it on the desk as he explained that the peace treaty had been signed, not because the Zephyrian Empire had been defeated militarily, but because their leadership had realized that continuing the war would eventually transform both species into something unrecognizable, and that humans possessed a psychological weapon, more powerful than any technology, which was their ability to make warfare itself evolve into forms that violated every principle of civilized behavior. The 3 remaining cadets sat in stunned silence as their instructor concluded his lessons about humanity by explaining that the peace had been necessary not to save human lives, but to save Zephyrian souls from the corruption that came from fighting an enemy that could weaponize concepts like loyalty and sacrifice and stubbornness. Never fight humans on their terms because their terms are simple, Vexhai said as he dismissed the class and watched the final cadets file out of the classroom with expressions that showed they would never again think of warfare as a civilized activity between rational species. They win or they make sure that winning costs you everything you are.